I admire your luck, Mr.
Bond. James Bond.
Who are you?
Bond. James Bond.
Good morning. My name's Bond. James Bond.
My name's Bond. James Bond.
Who are you?
Bond, James Bond.
Thank you, Mr.
The name's Bond. James Bond.
Hello?
Mr. White, we need to talk.
Who is this?
The name's Bond. James Bond.
James Bond.
If you've seen my previous episode, you'll already know what I think of the new 007 film, Spectre. But lately, there's been a lot of talk of the next actor to play 007 on the big screen, and much of that talk has been centered around actor Idris Elba. Now, whether or not he'd make a good Bond is another discussion, which I may or may not tackle at another time. I haven't decided yet. But the justification for casting Elba has revisited an idea that, as a Bond fan, that I've always had an issue with. And that idea is that many believe that James Bond is not a person, but a code name for MI6's top agent. So right now, I'd like to address this theory and the most commonly cited reasons for believing it. Let's get started, shall we? This is the most commonly cited reason why people believe the codename theory. Because Sean Connery, George Lazenby, Timothy Dalton, Pierce Brosnan, Roger Moore, and Daniel Craig all look and act differently, that all the Bonds must be different people. Yet we all see them make common references throughout the series. In On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Lazenby's Bond goes to the College of Arms and researches his lineage, tracing it back to Sir Thomas Bond, Earl of Peckham, died 1734, with the family motto, "The world is not enough." Brosnan tells Sophie Marceau's character in the film of the same title that it's a quote-unquote family motto. Both Connery and Moore's Bond make references to studying at Cambridge. When Lazenby's Bond marries Teresa Draco, they are introduced as Mr. and Mrs. James Bond. In Diamonds Are Forever, we see Connery hunting down Blofeld for revenge for killing Teresa. Barbara Bach makes a passing reference to her in The Spy Who Loved Me, and For Your Eyes Only, Moore leaves flowers at her grave. In A License to Kill, Felix Leiter says to his wife, played by Priscilla Barnes, he was married once, but that was a long time ago, connecting Dalton's Bond to the previous Bonds. There's also passing references to her in GoldenEye and The World Is Not Enough. And all the Bonds are members of the Royal Navy with the rank of Commander, and are addressed at some point as Commander Bond. They also share a continuous flirtation with Miss Moneypenny. If they were all different men, wouldn't the law of averages say that she wouldn't like at least one of them? So the evidence here all points to them being the same person. So we've established that the previous Bonds are all the same person. Now what about Daniel Craig? The film Casino Royale is a reboot of the James Bond timeline. This is a new Bond at the beginning of his career, separate from the previous Bonds. Even so, we still see more evidence that James Bond is his name. When checking into the Royale Hotel, Bond is supposed to give the name Beach, but instead he gives his real name to the concierge. Later in the film, James is typing out his resignation email and signs it James Bond. In Skyfall, M is writing out the obituary for Commander Bond. Later in Skyfall, we see the gravestones at the family estate of Andrew and Monique Delacroix Bond. Albert Finney's character, Kincaid, clearly recognizes him and calls him by his name, James Bond. When the family estate burns down, Daniel Craig says, "I've always hated this place." And in the most recent film, Spectre, we see the certificate of guardianship with the name Master Bond James. So it's established in this universe that James Bond is his name. It doesn't, but it does complicate things slightly. Remember, we're seeing a new Bond at the beginning of his career in a new timeline. So we're to assume that even though this M is played by Judi Dench, that it's a different character. The reason why Judi Dench is playing this M is because Barbara Broccoli and Michael Wilson, producers of the Bond series, said that bringing her back was too good to pass up. And if you had the chance to bring her back, you would too. Okay, I'll give you that's a fair point. But we have to remember that Bond is a cocky son of a When he gives his real name in Casino Royale, Vesper makes a comment about him being arrogant. Bond has used several different aliases in the past. In You Only Live Twice, he goes under the name Mr. Fisher. In On Her Majesty's Secret Service, he impersonates Sir Hilary Bray from the College of Arms. In A View to a Kill, he impersonates a reporter, James Stock, and a horse enthusiast, James St. Smythe. In From Russia with Love, he travels under the name David Somerset. In Diamonds Are Forever, he uses the name Peter Franks. In The World Is Not Enough, he uses the identity of a Russian nuclear scientist, Dr. Mikhail Arkov. Craig's Bond not only uses the name Arlington Beach from Casino Royale, he also uses the alias Richard Sterling from Universal Exports. So while his real name seems to be one of the worst kept secrets in international espionage, he does indeed use a variety of aliases. This is poor memory on most people's part. Craig won the car in Casino Royale in a poker game. The ejector seat switch in Skyfall was a meta joke for the 50th anniversary of the series. Bond drives whatever vehicle Q Branch issues him, or whatever he can steal most readily. As iconic a vehicle as the DB5 is, it was only driven by Sean Connery in 2 films, Goldfinger and Thunderball. In Dr. No, he drives a Sunbeam Alpine. In From Russia with Love, we briefly see the 1935 Bentley Mark IV. In On Her Majesty's Secret Service, he drives an Aston Martin DBS. Moore's Bond drives a Lotus Esprit in The Spy Who Loved Me and For Your Eyes Only. In The Living Daylights, Dalton drives an Aston Martin V8 Volante. Even though the DB5 does make an appearance in Tomorrow Never Dies and GoldenEye, Brosnan drives a BMW Z3 in GoldenEye, a BMW 750i in Tomorrow Never Dies, and a BMW Z8 in The World Is Not Enough. In Die Another Day, he drives an Aston Martin V12 Vanquish. In Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace, Craig's Bond drives an Aston Martin DBS. This is where something called suspension of disbelief comes into play. In order to buy into the world that they're creating, you are quite literally not supposed to be asking that question. Granted, at times, it doesn't always work. For example, does anybody really believe that Denise Richards is a nuclear scientist? And if a spy is supposed to keep a low profile, why would he drive a $200,000 sports car? But if we start analyzing every single detail, it all falls apart, which incidentally was one of the jokes that addressed this in Austin Powers' The Spy Who Shagged Me.
I suggest you don't worry about this sort of thing and just enjoy yourself. That goes for you all, too.
Yes.
No, it doesn't. That is a fourth wall breaking meta joke that Lazenby and director Peter Hunt decided to go with in order to introduce Lazenby in the role. For many who do believe the codename theory, they often cite this one line as their main source of evidence.
This never happened to the other fella.
The thinking here is that Lazenby's Bond is replacing Connery's Bond, and because Lazenby says this, surely these men are 2 different people. But the problem here is, if as many of the people who subscribe to the codename theory keep insisting that MI6's top agents are all reprogrammed, brainwashed, and their memories are all erased, then Lazenby's character would have no knowledge of any of the previous agents, or their behaviors, or their history, or the women they've been with, for that matter. Lazenby and Hunt thought it would be a good icebreaker, a sort of nudge-nudge wink-wink moment. The 1967 film Casino Royale is not an official Bond movie. Producer Charles Feldman had at the time acquired the rights to the novel, but couldn't come to terms with Harry Saltzman and Albert R. Broccoli to make a film version. So instead, he made the film as a satirical spoof of the spy genre. Sony and Columbia Pictures had the film rights to Casino Royale up until 1999. That's when they worked out a partial trade. MGM and United Artists would get Casino Royale, and Sony and Columbia Pictures in return would get Spider-Man, which seemed to work out pretty well for everybody involved. The 1967 version of Casino Royale, starring David Niven, is not connected to the Bond universe or series in any way, shape, or form. I will acknowledge, however, that the James Bond series continuity is an absolute mess. Like any other fan theory, you have to make several mental leaps which aren't supported by any evidence in the film to make the codename theory work. And for those who do believe the codename theory, why are we saying only James Bond is a codename? There have been a total of 7 actors who have played Felix Leiter. So is Felix Leiter a codename for the CIA's top agent? Actress Martine Beswick played Zora, a fighting girl in From Russia with Love, and Bond's assistant Paula Kaplan in Thunderball. So when she died in Thunderball, did she commit suicide fearing her cover was really blown? Actress Maud Adams played Andrea Anders in The Man with the Golden Gun, and Octopussy in the movie of the same name. What's their connection? Actor Joe Don Baker played Brad Whitaker in The Living Daylights, and Agent Jack Wade in GoldenEye. Was Whitaker really a government operative? 3 different actors with 3 distinct looks, Donald Pleasance, Telly Savalas, and Charles Gray, all played Blofeld. Gray, in fact, played Australian agent Deco Henderson in You Only Live Twice. So was Blofeld really impersonating Australian agent Deco Henderson? Is Blofeld really a codename for whomever ascends the Spectre hierarchy? And why didn't Blofeld recognize Bond at the Institute? And why stop there? Alec Baldwin looks different than Harrison Ford. Is Jack Ryan really a code name? In the Back to the Future movies, Marty McFly's girlfriend is played by Claudia Wells and Elizabeth Shue. In Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy, Rachel Dawes is played by Maggie Gyllenhaal and Katie Holmes. Was that because the real Rachel Dawes had to go into witness protection? In Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, Lieutenant Saavik was played by Kirstie Alley, but in The Search for Spock, she was played by Robin Curtis. And then Kirstie Alley reprised the role for a cameo in Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home. What's up with that? Is Lieutenant Saavik a codename for Starfleet's top science officer? And why are there two different Bruce Banners? Did S.H.I.E.L.D. replace the Ed Norton version with Mark Ruffalo? The point is, we can do this all day. There used to be something called suspension of disbelief where you would just turn off your brain and go with it. But now it seems certain fans need all those dots connected. Maybe Hollywood needs to start doing what soap operas have been doing for the more short attention span of those and announce who the actor is replacing another actor. At least before someone starts asking, hey, why doesn't Chevy Chase notice he has different kids in every movie? To sum up, bottom line, James Bond. Not a codename, it's a guy. Go with it. See you next time.